So this afternoon, I want to talk about the African influence in the Bible, Old Testament in particular, or Africa and the Bible. And you'll see why I think this subject is important as we go along. Um, Let me start out with a biblical text, Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 to 27. And it reads thus: Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and by these or from these the whole earth was populated. Noah began to be a farmer. He planted a vineyard. Then he drank the wine and was drunk. And he became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and he went and told his brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment. They laid it on both their shoulders. They went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So when Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his younger son had done to him, then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." But he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." This text, found in Genesis chapter 9, was a very important text in the antebellum South, the United States, and elsewhere in the colonial world, particularly as it relates to slavery. And this is because slave owners, who were Christian, by the way, saw this text as their, what many have said, their vademecum, meaning their raison d'être, their reason for being. It was the pretext upon which, religiously anyways, the enslavement of Africans were justified, because it was believed that Canaan, or rather Ham, was cursed, and consequently all of Ham's descendants were cursed. And because Ham was connected, at least anthropologically at that time anyways, geographically or biblically, they made a bunch of connections with Ham and Africa. Consequently, all of Africans, particularly sub-Saharan Africans, were considered the descendants of Ham, and therefore subject to this curse by Noah. And so there was this prevailing view that Africans were enslaved, not just in the modern world, but also in the ancient world. That they were indeed the slaves of the Bible, the slaves in the ancient context, inasmuch as they were the slaves in the modern period. So this was a very powerful pretext upon which to base the enslavement of one's brother. So African in 19th century America, let's use that as the basis for this argument. Essentially, Africans were part of the human brotherhood, but they were the lowest part of it. Okay, and biblically, they were cursed to be perennially enslaved. And no doubt, many biblical commentaries at this period and well into the 20th century basically had this view, or at least projected the view, that Africans were enslaved from the ancient world and were the slaves in ancient Israel. So let me give you a couple of examples. Amos 9 verse 7 says of the Israelites, "Are you not like the Cushites to me, the Ethiopians? O Israel, declare Yahweh. Are you not like the Cushites to me?" An interesting text. What do commentators, what did they say this text meant at the time? Well, William Harper, who wrote one of the best-selling commentaries at the time, he says, "Israel, says the prophet, is no more to me than the far distant, uncivilized, and despised black race of Ethiopians. No reference is made to their Hamitic origin or their black skin, and yet their color and the fact that slaves were so often drawn from them added to the grounds for despising them." So this biblical scholar says the ancient Israelites were being humiliated by being compared to the far distant, despised, uncivilized, and obviously enslaved African, Ethiopian. Another commentary to the 20th century, James L. Mays in 1969, Mays wrote that on the evidence, same text, one can say no more than that the Cushites were a distant, different folk whom the Israelites knew mostly as slaves. You are to me, says Yahweh, as these Cushites are to you. What the comparison does is to humiliate Israel completely, to reduce them to the role in Yahweh's order of things, which the Cushite played in their own society, presumably enslaved. So the Israelites again are being compared to the Cushites, who were presumably the enslaved in ancient Israel and beyond, apparently across the entire ancient geographic spectrum. So the notion that the Cushites / the Ethiopians, black folks in the Bible, were cursed, enslaved, despised, distant, insignificant, unknown, prevailed in much of biblical scholarship well into the 20th century. And even still today, depending on where you go, you can still see remnants of these views, the idea of Africans being cursed. And I could show you some things on video that would send shut up your spine, but I don't have time today. The way that people still believe that black folks are fulfilling this particular curse from Noah's time. But something interesting happened in the middle of the 19th century. Another view began to contest this older view of the cursedness, enslavement, and especially the Hamitic origin of black folks. And this particular view was brought forward or championed by I'm actually going to get in the biblical text a bit later, but right now I want to just kind of set the background for it. The American School of Ethnology, with anthropologists, ethnologists, medical doctors, among others, they were the foremost thinkers in the United States in this time period when it came to so-called racial science or ethnography, or rather they called it ethnology at the time. And so what happened was ancient Egypt was discovered. So at the turn of the 19th century, Napoleon and his soldiers and French scholars went into Egypt, and they began to discover this lost civilization. And this was the beginning of Egyptology as a discipline. And so they began to discover this civilization of tremendous monuments, magnificent monuments and paintings and iconography and so forth. And they essentially said, wow, the iconography that we're seeing of these people show them to be Africans, as in Africans, what it means to be Africans, the so-called typical Negro, sub-Saharan African, people like Denon, Gregoire, and other French scholars were writing these things. And the American school did not like it very much. And so the American school basically set out to dispel this whole idea that Africans were supposed to be connected with Hamites in the first place. So now we see a civilization, because presumably all Africans were Hamites. Then you see this, and presumably backwards and incapable of civilization. Now you see this magnificent civilization of ancient Egypt with scholars now, French scholars, and then later on other European scholars begin to connect with, began to see as the progenitor of Greek culture, and then of course Greek influencing Europe and so on. So they're looking at ancient Egypt and they're saying high civilization in ancient Egypt. This could not have been created by black Hamites. Something needed to change. And so we begin to see some of these scholars, such as those that I have on my screen here of the American school, like Samuel Morton and Josiah C. Nutt and George R. Glidden, among others. They began to basically change the narrative and say, we can no longer sustain this idea that Africans are Hamites. And of course, in the back of their minds, there's a high civilization which we trace our heritage to, our own civilization to, cannot and could not have been created by Africans. And they were unabashed in actually stating that quite clearly. And so they began this new exegesis to dispel this idea of connecting all Africans to Hamites and therefore to the biblical history. And now they begin to disassociate Africans from Hamites. So in his volume on ancient Egypt, published in 1843, for example, George R. Glidden was one of the foremost to start this argument. And he says that Canaan, referring to the text I just read to you from Genesis chapter 9, he says Canaan was not physically changed in consequence of the curse. He ever remained a white man, as did and do all his many descendants. So no scriptural production can be found that would support an hypothesis so absurd as that in consequence of the curse, Canaan was transmuted into a Negro, right? And it says, if then with the curse branded on Canaan and his whole posterity, the Almighty did not see fit to change his skin, his hair, his bones, or any portion of his physical structure, how unjust, how baseless is that theory, the dominant one at the time, unsupported by a line of scripture and in diametrical opposition to monumental history and testimony, meaning the Egyptian monuments and all that's coming out of Egyptology. So how unsupported, diametrically opposite, he says, which would make Canaan's immediate progenitor Ham the father of the Negroes, or his apparently blameless brother Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, an Ethiopian. Absurd to the 10th power, says Glidden in his text. And of course there were many others at the time arguing this, and I document quite a bit of it in my own work. So essentially you had two streams. One said Africans were cursed. That's the reason why they were enslaved on plantations in the West Indies and the United States. This curse that was pronounced on them by Noah, and but they were still part of the brotherhood. Now we see this conundrum. An ancient civilization of sophistication that was now found to have connections to the West. And now we need to distance ourselves, or more importantly, distance Africans from this civilization. So this was the nature of this new exegesis, which Samuel Morton, Glidden, and the numerous others undertook. So in their bestseller, Types of Mankind, published in 1854, so Josiah C. Knott, whose picture you saw earlier, and Egyptologist George R. Glidden, this was the field of Egyptology was in its infancy at this time, and Glidden himself had spent quite a bit of time in Egypt, curating artifacts and so forth. So they came back in 1954 and wrote the bestseller. I mean, this was the text of text on ethnology, read by anybody who was anybody at the time. So according to Knott and Glidden, they said that the author of Genesis omits Negro races altogether from his tripartite classification of humanity under the symbolic appellatives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Negroes are not even mentioned, he says, according to the author of Genesis. He omits them. I wonder why he omits them. And further on, we see where he says the Negro races are never alluded to in ancient Jewish literature. Negroes are not mentioned at all in the ancient Jewish texts, right? And the so-called Negro or Ethiopia that is in Jewish literature is a false interpretation of the Hebrew Cush, which always means southern Arabia and nothing but the Cushite Arabian race, not Negroes. Negroes are not mentioned at all in the text. They would affirm. Furthermore, Samuel Morton, who was their predecessor, he says there is no ancient Ethiopia, rather. He says the ancient Ethiopians had no affinity, even in the remotest times, to the Negro race. So there is this concerted effort among the American school to remove the Negro now, which it had served slave owners, and we're talking about 1854. Remember that slavery ended in the British Empire in 1833, technically 1837. And of course, in the American Revolution and the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, 1865 there. So we're talking just on the moral of the ending of enslavement. And so now they're changing the narrative. The Negro is no longer, that narrative is no longer needed. So the Negro now must be removed from the Bible and removed from ancient Egypt and removed from the ancient world. And indeed, even ancient Ethiopia would no longer have connection to the Negro according to this stream of exegesis. So, according to Samuel Morton, he says the valley of the Nile, both in Egypt and Nubia. Nubia is what I talked about this morning, where the kingdom of Meroe was, or the Napatan kingdom, and later became Meroe, where the Ethiopian eunuch originated from. So, according to them, the valley of the Nile, both in Egypt and in the Sudan, okay, that's where Nubia is, was originally peopled by a branch of the Caucasian race, okay? And this, don't underestimate how influential Crania Aegyptica was at the time by Morton, and then the others who came after him. They published numerous volumes to the same for the same argument. So essentially, remove the Negro altogether, even from the Nile Valley, which was ironically in Africa. The Egyptologist Heinrich Bruschk, who was one of the ones to write a major treatise on Nubian history in 1877, he basically said that the Egyptians, in his text, he says, the Egyptians appeared to form a branch of the Caucasian race, the family called Cushite, who left the soil of their native home to find a new fatherland on the banks of the Nile. So he's going back to an ancient source who said it was the Cushites who founded Egyptian civilization. So he says, on that basis, it's actually the Cushites were Caucasians who came to the new, left their native homeland in Ethiopia, in Kush, to found a new civilization in Egypt. So, which was an interesting argument, to say the least. So for the same reason, most of you are probably heard of the famous Egyptologist, the father of Egyptology, Sir Flinders Petrie. And Sir Flinders Petrie, following the same exegetical trajectory, basically says that he reached a simple conclusion that North Africa, Egypt, and Syria were occupied by allied tribes of European character. So the ancient Egyptian civilization must now represent what is an ancient branch of the Caucasian race. Hence the reason why ancient Egypt could have achieved such a high level of civilization. It could not have been attributed to black folks. So we see across the board this concerted effort now to remove Africans from North Africa, from Egypt, from the Nile Valley, and assert that the peoples that were there, who incidentally are still Hamites, but they're no longer black enslaved Hamites. They're now white European Hamites. So the great ethnologist Charles Seligman in 1930 wrote his famous Races of Africa, and he says in it, he says the civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites. So it's the idea, now the Hamites are no longer black, they're now been transmuted into white. So now it's the white Hamites that have brought civilization to Africa. So anything in Africa, you talked about Great Zimbabwe, that I was mentioning with Pastor Guzman earlier, the Great Zimbabwe, and any semblance of civilization that we find in Africa, whether North Africa, Central, anywhere in Africa, came there by outsiders, invaders, Caucasian Hamites who brought civilization. And it rested on the premise that Africa and Africans were incapable of civilization. They were incapable of anything of high culture and so on. And of course, you got to put this in context. We're talking about, again, the slave trade and all of the histories that have been written at the time, that Africans were backwards, they contributed nothing to civilization, and so on and so forth. And so there was this slanted history to rewriting of history to essentially remove civilization from Africans and basically said they were incapable of anything of value. And of course, this was not removed from the biblical world by any means. The biblical scholar Archibald Sayce wrote a very important and influential text called The Races of the Old Testament. in 1891. And he says that Ethiopia, according to Sayce, drawing on these other scholars, was inhabited for the most part by a white race whose physical characteristics connect them with the Egyptians. So essentially, biblically now, and his book was enormously influential on the theological world. That the ancient Cushites, the ancient Ethiopians, were, and ancient Ethiopia itself, as I mentioned, inhabited by Caucasians who were affiliated with the Caucasian Egyptians themselves. So it's this claiming of an ancient civilization as the progenitor of Western civilization. It couldn't possibly have been black. It had to have been created by white Hamites. The biblical scholar Martin Nutt, even in the 1960s, he wrote his famous Old Testament text in the 1960s, and Martin Nutt basically says that the ancient Egyptians portrayed the Cushites in an incorrect manner. This is what the biblical scholar says. The ancient Egyptians, on their walls, on their monuments, portrayed the Cushites in an incorrect manner with typical Negro faces, incorrectly classifying the Nubians as Negroes. The Nubians were at most very slightly related to Negro tribes bordering them on the south. And this is really the height of ignorance, I would say, or maybe hubris, I don't know. Where a biblical scholar would say the ancient Egyptians who knew the Nubians most represented them on their walls, on their monuments, in texts. He said that the ancient Egyptians represented them in an incorrect manner. Which is mind-boggling to think that the ancient Egyptians did not know the people with whom they were engaging, that they represented them not over a year or 10 or even 100 years, but over centuries in an incorrect manner. Is it the ancient Egyptians that's at fault, or is it the scholarship, the particular trajectory to remove a particular people from the ancient world or the biblical world? So we see this trajectory on the one hand for the duration of enslavement. Pretty much we have the curse of Ham, the idea of Hamites being cursed and black Africans and therefore perennially subject to Noah's curse. And then just around the dawn of emancipation, or just in that region, we see this, and particularly with the discovery of ancient Egypt. That was the catalyst that brought about this shift in interpretation. Now the Hamites were no longer black and cursed. They were white, and they were the progenitors of civilization. They were the masters of civilization brought to Africa. Consequently, in a host of, whether it's books, TV shows, movies, etc., we see pictures of ancient Egyptians that just look like normal Caucasian folks, right? If you look at any of the pharaohs, they're typically just a normal-looking European of some kind. But this is particularly the result of this exegesis and this trajectory of interpretation by these very, very influential scholars. We are removed from the 19th century, and sometimes we may not be aware of the influence that they had at the time. But these were the top thinkers in the world, not just they influenced Europe across the Atlantic, okay, in terms of their influence. And so today, whether it's in movies and others, we've seen these faces of typical Egyptians. This is what they look like, and folks that look dark skin, etc., were nowhere to be found, or are usually nowhere to be found in the texts, in the movies. Many of you have seen Charlton Heston's movie, The Ten Commandments, if you're old enough, if you're like me back in the day. And we see what Queen Nefertiti looked like in this portrait here. And of course, Moses standing before the Pharaoh. Just a normal scene of Europeans. It's basically you project the modern world of dominance back into the ancient context. And of course, the the Israelites are released from enslavement. And the only time that black folks make an appearance, they did incidentally make an appearance as Cushites, but not in any kind of civilized way, just little half-dressed, half clad, dancers with their little, what do you call it, their little bamboo skirts, or, and so the point is to draw a contrast between the civilization, the high civilization of the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. So in any case, part of my research has been I wanted to understand where black folks fit into the biblical world and the biblical text. Because we're here, we're here, and if we've always been around, I suspect Africa has been around, since like any other part of the world. What were they doing? And how did their histories intersect with the biblical story? Can I read the Bible and find myself in it? I've been trying to figure out, well, many years now, but that's what led me on my research, even before I started Berman or started a PhD program. So, what I'm going to share with you for the next few minutes is ancient testimony. Well, is part of the counter argument to suggest, hey, maybe not maybe, but these scholars had an agenda in the way that they sought to represent the ancient world, and it has crumbled essentially to reveal the realities. And then I'll get into the Cushites specifically. So I'm only going to show you a few of these. I can't, for the interest of time, I can't show you all of them. But ancient folks, essentially Herodotus and others, knew the ancient Cushites and Egyptians, and they had they had quite a bit to say about them. So Herodotus, in his histories, says it is in fact manifest that the Colchians, the people who lived in the Black Sea region, South Russia, Georgia, Circassia, that the Colchians are Egyptian by race. My own idea on this subject was based first on the fact that they have black skins and woolly hair, and secondly, and more especially on the fact that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only race which from ancient times have practiced circumcision. Of course, he was kind of wrong, because we know the Hebrews did too, but nonetheless, he connects this, he's making the connection that these people, by the way, in the Black Sea region, South Russia and Circassia, have African origin, or because they have black skin and they have woolly hair. Everybody knows what woolly hair looks like this. So Herodotus was saying, first of all, they were out of place, because how could they be? And so his argument was that they were from Sesostris' army when the Pharaoh came north, that these and they had planted colonies in Georgia and other places. And so he said they left colonists there, and that's why we had these people in South Russia, Circassia, which actually prevailed into the 20th century, and Russia had a concerted effort to rid itself of these people. That's another story there. But in any case, Herodotus, basically, his whole argument is that they came from Egypt. And the reason why, because they don't look like the peoples that are normally in this area. These people have black skin and they have woolly hair. So they are Egyptian or an Ethiopian. They practice circumcisions like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. I could show you more but I'll pass. Here is Diodorus of Sicily, writing in the 3rd century BC. He says, now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, so this was known history to him, this was quite ubiquitous at the time. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. And who's he going back to? He's going back to Homer, because Homer talks about the Ethiopians, the blameless Ethiopians who reside among the gods, and essentially these are the people to admire. Okay, that was Homer. They dwell the farthest of men, sundered in twain, the blameless Ethiopians. They dine with all the gods, the Greek gods, by the way, because they know all their gods came out of Egypt/Ethiopia. So, according to Diodorus, he says, now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. And the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. There are many of these proofs, he says. They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, which is what Brush, that I mentioned earlier, was alluding to. He's alluding to Diodorus, because it was an ancient account that the Egyptians, the Egyptian civilization started from the south, that it was Cushites that came in from the south. But from Bruce's perspective, he changed it. These are not Africans, Cushites, but rather Caucasian Cushites coming from the south. So Theodore says that they also say that the Egyptians are colonists sent out. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are all facts, but rather I'm suggesting this is what was said among these ancient peoples, right? The Greeks. This is Greek scholars or Greek folks we're reading here. So they say that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, and the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are, they hold, Ethiopian, the colonists still preserving their ancient manners. So he says this is well known. This is well known stuff that historians have related to us. Why was Egyptian culture such an interest to the Greeks? Well, we know that, well, you'll see in a moment, that the Greeks understood that their gods and their culture came from Egypt. And vice versa, Egypt was influenced by Ethiopia and vice versa. And so you'll see that in a bit here. And so they essentially said that, and moreover, that's one of the reasons why Alexander the Great, conquered Egypt when he did eventually conquer Egypt, and he named the capital city Alexandria. Right? There was a great admiration in Greece, ancient Greece, for Egyptian culture. Next statement is by Pseudo-Aristotle, also writing in the 3rd century BC. And Aristotle says, those who are too black are cowards, like, for instance, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. But those who are excessively white are also cowards, as we can be seen from the example of women. The complexion of courage is between the two. If you're brown or you're tanned, you are courageous. If you're too dark, if you're too light, you are a coward, he says. But what's important for us here is that he groups the Egyptians and the Ethiopians together as the example of those who are too dark, who are cowards, okay, and so forth. And in Greek society, the women who are obviously indoors most of the time are also very light in complexion. If you're dark or tanned, you're not dark. If you're in between, right? If you're in the middle, you're good. So the comparison is just to suggest, and I could give you many more examples of this, of ancient testimony as to the Egyptians and Cushites and so forth and what they looked like, etc. But let's go to modern Egyptologists who themselves have changed course drastically as compared to these earlier 19th century scholars. People like Martin Burrell in his several volumes, but this one is the African, Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, meaning Africa as the root of Greek. Classical civilization is Greek civilization. And so Burrell says that Egyptian civilization was fundamentally African, and that the African element was stronger in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Many of the most powerful Egyptian dynasties, which were based in Upper Egypt, were made up of pharaohs, whom one can usefully call black. Many of the most powerful dynasties in Upper Egypt, as in closer to the Sudan, which makes sense. I mean, the Sudan and Egypt shared a border. In fact, ancient Nubia was in modern-day Egypt, the latter part of modern-day Egypt. You had ancient Nubia. They shared a border. And so it's like Canada and the U.S., or the U.S. and Mexico, Germany and France, you share a border. And if you shared a border for thousands of years, whether it's war, diplomacy, whatever it is, migration, trade, you have all kinds of reasons to move cross-border, right? So he says most of these powerful dynasties came from down south, right? The southern part of Egypt, which was next to the Sudanese border, the border of Nubia. Here's another gentleman, Dr. Stewart Tyson Smith. He's an Egyptologist out of Berkeley. And here he's writing, actually I sat on a panel with him last January. Several Egyptologists invited me to a conference because I wrote a book on the ancient Cushites / the ancient Nubians, and many of these are Nubiologists. They write about the ancient Nubians, but from an archaeological perspective, historiographic perspective, and mine is from a biblical, but also historical perspective. So I sat on a panel with them and a number of other Egyptologists. It's available on YouTube. So he's writing in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt. This is no light publication. And he says, any characterization of the race of the ancient Egyptians depend on modern cultural definitions, not scientific study. So he's defining race based on how we define it in the modern term, right? Just largest skin color, if we, for the most part. So he says, thus by modern American standards, if you're going by how race is defined in the United States, he says it is reasonable to characterize the Egyptians as black, while acknowledging the scientific evidence for the physical diversity of Africans. So if you're going to go based on modern definition, the ancient Egyptians were fundamentally an African peoples. Dr. Sally Ann Ashton, an Egyptologist also and the curator at the Fitzgerald Museum in Cambridge, she wrote a book on Cleopatra, which set off a furor in the UK because she portrayed Cleopatra as a black woman of Greek heritage. She's mixed, obviously, with the Ptolemaic dynasty, and so and she shows the number of coins and other iconography that shows her as an African, even though some does depict her as a normal Greek. So that you have both, and she says she's clearly an African woman. It was quite a furor when her book came out. Nonetheless, she says, it is perhaps significant that when you ask people if the ancient Egyptians were African, the majority will say yes on account of the country's geographical location. However, if you ask, were the ancient Egyptians black, you will get a different response. The concept of the exhibition, this was an exhibition at the Fitzgerald Museum for several years. The concept of the exhibition was to show images that strongly support the idea that the people of ancient Kemet, that's what they call themselves, Egypt is a Greek name that the Greeks gave to the country, but ancient Kemet were what we would consider today black Africans. Of course, she has many publications in which she makes this argument. So the point is that when you look at the evidence objectively rather than being driven by an ideology, then you will make better sense of the evidence. If you listen to the ancient peoples, you're listening to modern Egyptology, and of course, if you listen to now what is scientific, the DNA evidence, right? So this is the scientific DNA evidence. A 2009 study finds Nubians, the closest people ethnically to the ancient Egyptians. Surprise, surprise. They are. This is a study by a number of geneticists here. And so let me just read a little bit of it. It may not be too clear on. Maybe it's actually clearer over here than on my screen. So, on this basis, many have postulated, okay, let me go back up here. Both mtDNA and Y chromosome data collected by these people indicate that migrations, usually bidirectional, two-direction, occurred along the Nile. Thus, the osteological bone material used in this analysis also support the DNA evidence. On this basis, many have postulated that the Badarians, just a group of Nubians, are relative to South African populations, measurements taken by The archaeological evidence points to this relationship as well. Which is what relationship? Noted similarity, Hassan noted similarities between Badarian pottery and Neolithic Khartoum, indicating an archaeological affinity among Badarians and Africans from more southern regions. Essentially, maybe up at the top gives you a clearer idea, because I read the article several times. I know what it's saying, but up at the top it says that the Mahalanoid Nobis D2 analysis uncovered close affinities between Nubians and Egyptians. Table 3 lists the distance matrix. In some cases, the statistics reveal that the Egyptian sample were more similar to Nubian samples than to other Egyptian samples, and vice versa. The clustering of the Nubian and Egyptian samples together support this paper's hypotheses and demonstrate that there may have been a close relationship between these two populations. This relationship is consistent with Berry and Berry, among others, who noted a similarity between Nubian and Egyptians. And I can show you, I document quite a bit of it, that it was often often very difficult to tell an Egyptian versus a Nubian apart. Genetic study by DNA Tribe came out with, they studied the Amarna pharaohs. These are the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. If, dealing with like pharaohs like Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, Queen T, among others. These are the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom period. This is the most powerful period in Egyptian history. And so DNA Tribe says, you probably can't see it at the top of your screen there, but average MLA scores indicate the SR profiles of the Amarna mummies, so they did testing on these mummies, would be most frequent in present-day populations of several African regions. So if you take these genetic profiles from these mummies, they are most frequent in African regions today, including the Southern African, the African Great Lakes, and the tropical West African region. So if you are studying these mummies, how do I do the laser? Yeah, I was looking for. Oh, there it is. Turn it around. Okay. So if you can see here with these profiles of these mummies, that if you're in Southern Africa, the frequency is 326 times. And as you move into African Great Lakes, still in Africa, Horn of Africa, once you're moving into Levantine, this is now Syria, Palestine, you can see how the numbers drop precipitously. So these are peoples that had origin in Africa. As you can see, this is where the locus of concentration for these alleles are, right? So the results, you can read it here. Results indicate the autosomal SDR profile of the Amarna period mummies were most frequent in modern populations in several parts of Africa. These results are based on 8 markers that they studied, for which these pharaonic mummies have been tested, which allow a preliminary geographical analysis for the individuals who lived in Egypt during the Amarna period in the 14th century BC. We're talking way, way back, even before at least if in the late days before Israel came into the land of Canaan, for example. And so you will see they show the analysis here again of other mummies that are tested at the same time. And you can see the occurrence here once you move into the Levant. So now you're moving out of Africa into the Levant. You can see how the numbers drop here. 14 compared to 335. These are the concentration of where these people came from the south into the north, into Egypt. DNA consultants, another DNA firm, this is not DNA, the one I just showed you, studied another 18th dynasty mummy, and they studied several others, which I don't have time to go into all of them, just the basic I'm showing you. So Tutankhamun, whom we've seen his death mask and things like that nature, Tutankhamun's mummy, he belongs to the 18th dynasty pharaoh, was also tested now by DNA consultants, and they said Tutankhamun is the most famous of all pharaohs. He was the son and successor of Akhenaten, grandson of Amenhotep III and Queen T. I'll show you their portraits in a moment, their iconography. And the great-grandson of the royal matriarch, Queen Thuya. Archaeologist Howard Carter's opening of his intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922 ranks among the most splendid discoveries of history. In 2010, a genetic fingerprinting of his mummy determined that he died at the early age of 19 as a result of violence or an accident to which the incestuous relationship of his parents and several genetic defects contributed. That's a whole nother history there. So Tutankhamun actually carries a double dose of the allele name for him. Like most of the other genes in the family, it is Central African in ancient origin, but unlike the other markers, it has a sparse distribution outside of Africa with a worldwide average frequency of 4%. Still, Africans and African-influenced population, 1 in about 10, are about twice or 3 times as likely to have it as non-Africans. And you can see where the transatlantic slave trade spread this particular marker of Tutankhamun across the rest of the globe. So whether it's Tutankhamun, Queen Thi, Thuya, it's Akhenaten, and a number of others, even from the 20th dynasty, they've done testing, DNA testing, and it shows more or less the same thing, that these peoples are of African origin, and that scholars such as the American school scholars, among others, basically twisted the evidence to suit their ideology. Right? And they saw these iconography when the French scholars, and I could show you a number of French scholars, were saying, when they looked at the Sphinx, for example, this is an African face. And these scholars says we can't have that. That's not possible. So therefore, it's untenable. We need to move in another direction. So Denon, Gregoire, and numerous other French scholars in the time of Napoleon were postulating that these are African peoples, and as according to Denon, who were actually our slaves. Can you imagine these people who are slaves today are the founders of the great civilization? There was a cognitive dissonance that needed to be resolved. So here is another study, again by this is Ramses the third, not the Ramses the second that is often associated with the Exodus, but it really matters little. This is in the 20th dynasty, where it says so Ramses III, an African ancestry in the 20th dynasty of the New Kingdom Egypt. So one dynasty was overthrown, came the 19th, another dynasty overthrown, and so they're doing testing on these different dynasties, but also still finding that these are people of African origin. In recent years, genetic data have become available not only for present-day populations around the world, but also for ancient individuals. When ancient individuals are tested, results can illuminate the geographical links between populations during early periods and provide clues about the relationship between ancient and modern populations. In some cases, DNA results can reflect population expansions and migrations that have taken place after a period when the ancient individuals lived. So the January 2012 issue of DNA Tribes included autosomal SDR analysis of King Tutankhamun, several of the 18th dynasty pharaohs' mummies. So that's the study I showed you. This is another study here. DNA results identified alleles that today are most frequent in sub-Saharan Africa and found a Middle Eastern population at lower frequencies. I showed you 300 plus compared to 6. This suggests a sub-Saharan African genetic component for the Amarna period royal family, but does not exclude the possibility of additional ancestral components for those ancient individuals. Yeah, so if there are other peoples who might have been in the population as well, their genes are going to be mixed up in there, obviously. So to expand on these results, this month's article includes geographical analysis of autosomal SDR profiles from a later pharaonic family of the 20th dynasty, Ramses III, and another man, possibly his son. Ramses III reigned, this is the time period here, BC. This is before David built, this is the time of the judges in Israel. So the book of Judges, during the transition from the late bronze to the early iron. During this period, the influence of the New Kingdom Egypt was declining, and new independent cultures were emerging around Egypt's imperial frontiers. These changes involved several population movements during and after the time of Ramses III. These migrations include Nubian and Nilotic expansion from the Upper Nile, etc., etc., etc. So, long story short, this is what the study says. They've tested several components of his DNA among the other gentlemen that they found, and it's the exact same result as the previous study. Let me move on here real quick. So he says, again, among present-day population, Ramses III autosomal STR profile is most frequent in the African Great Lakes, which is approximately 335 times as frequent in the world as a whole. So this is where it's concentrated, his DNA. Unknown man, the unknown man, E's autosomal STR profile is most frequent in the southern African region, where it's approximately 134 times as frequent as in the world as a whole, and so on and so forth. So specifically, both of these ancient individuals inhabited these alleles, which were found throughout sub-Saharan Africa, but are comparatively rare or absent in other regions of the world. These African-related alleles identified for the previous study from the Amarna period. So they had different alleles that they tested for the Amarna pharaohs. Then they tested these from another dynasty, and they found all of them are most frequent in sub-Saharan Africa, which goes back to the ancient testimony, to what we had Herodotus and numerous others said about the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, and then later, of course, where we have now modern Egyptologists are acknowledging this as much. This is almost the last thing I'm going to say in this here. So you can see where this is a study done, as you can see, by probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 geneticists did this study, and they actually have several others of this study. I'm showing you only one. And it says HLA genes in Macedonians and the sub-Saharan origin of the Greeks. Remember, I showed you earlier that the Greeks said that their culture came from the south, both from Egypt as well. Well, now they're saying that HLA alleles have been determined in individuals from the Republic of Macedonia by DNA typing and sequencing, and they show you the number of alleles frequencies, and extended haplotypes have been, for the first time, determined, and the results compared to those of other Mediterraneans, particularly with neighboring Greeks. So genetic distances, neighboring dendrograms, and corresponding analysis have been performed. The following conclusions have been reached. This is what they conclude. Macedonians belong to the older Mediterranean stratum, like Iberians, including Basque, North Africans, Italians, Macedonians are not related with geographically close Greeks who do not belong to the older Mediterranean substratum. Greeks are found to have a substantial relatedness to sub-Saharan African Ethiopian peoples, which separate them from other Mediterranean groups. See, Herodotus knew and understood it, and so did the others. It's the modern scientists or modern scholars who've denied this. So both Greeks and Ethiopians share quasi-specific alleles such as that, and that. Genetic distances are closer between Greeks and Ethiopian/sub-Saharan groups than to any other Mediterranean groups. And finally, Greeks cluster with Ethiopian sub-Saharan in both neighboring joining dendrograms and corresponding analysis. The time period when these relationships might have occurred was ancient but uncertain and might be related to the displacement of Egyptian Ethiopian peoples living in Pharaonic Egypt. So, when Burrell wrote his book about the African origin of classical civilization, he didn't have genetic evidence to back up what he was saying. He was going based on ancient testimonies and iconography and so forth. But now you have the genetics. And I have, like I said, several of these studies that relate the same information. So here it is. Thus it is hypothesized that there could have been a migration from southern Sahara mixed with ancient Greeks to give rise to a part of the present-day genetic Greek background. The admixture must have occurred in the Aegean Islands and Athens era at least. The reason why this admixture is not seen in Crete is unclear, but may be related to the influential and strong Minoan Empire, which hindered foreign establishment. In other words, they were colonists, as what Herodotus said. Also, the time when admixture occurred could be after the overthrow of some of the Negroid Egyptian dynasties, Nubian or other period, or after undetermined natural catastrophes. Indeed, ancient Greeks believed that their religion and culture came from Egypt. And they did. And we can see many of these art where you can clearly identify an African and Greek and two Africans there, and so on and so forth. So, the iconography that you don't see, and of course, this is not to suggest that other peoples were not in Egypt. Egypt, by the way, what the argument is that Egypt was a fundamentally African culture. But there are numerous other peoples that came into Egypt. We have, for example, the Hyksos from Syria, Palestine, that ruled Egypt in the time of Joseph, for example. Later on, we have the Assyrians that came in and ruled Egypt. The Persians came in after them and ruled Egypt. Then we had the Greeks that came in and ruled Egypt. Then we had the Romans that came in and ruled Egypt. Then we had the Arabs that came in and ruled Egypt in the time of the Islamic expansion. So you have numerous peoples from outside that have mixed in with the Egyptian population from time immemorial. And so Egypt, even in ancient time, was a mixed culture, but fundamentally African. That's the argument. It is not to preclude the fact that there were even Greeks living in Egypt at different times. People from the Aegean and various places living in Egypt. People from the north, Syria, Palestine. Many Bedouins and Canaanites. Many of them Libyans themselves, which were lighter, almost whiter folks that were in Egypt. So it is not to preclude other peoples being in Egypt, but it's the idea that Egypt was a fundamentally African civilization, and the proof is in the genetics, the proof is in the ancient testimony, proof is in the modern testimony, proof is in the genetic studies. So here is an actual bust of Tutankhamun. Here is his grandmother, Queen T, that we mentioned before, her husband, Thutmosis III, both in the 14th century BC, before Israel became a nation in Syria, Palestine. This is husband and wife together. Here's a bust of them together. This is Queen T. Notice her profile there. This is her husband that I just showed you, except he's cut off. Thutmosis III, he's cut off from her. Akhenaten, who is their son. Okay, he's married to Nefertiti. This is one bust of her, but not the only one. Sometimes she has a different African type feature. This is Thuya that was mentioned earlier. And you can see here are just iconography of peoples that lived in ancient Egypt. That's just normal African peoples. These people are actually Nubians. This is the 25th dynasty, which I'll tell you about more specifically in a little bit here. But this is the 25th dynasty pharaohs, a number of them. So from Alaric to Shabaka to Taharuka, Alara, among others. This is Taharuka, mentioned in the Bible, which I'll show you in a moment here, worshiping his god. This is his sphinx. This is his Sphinx. This is his brother Shabaka, also in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and so on. So a lot of these things were not. This is a pharaoh from the second pharaoh of the 5th dynasty. This is even earlier than the Middle Kingdom time period. We're talking 18 time of Abraham, let's say, in that time frame. And many of these iconographies show Egyptians with reddish brown skin to dark skin sometimes, but also sometimes light, especially the women, and so on. So you can see the various activities they're involved in, but the iconography shows them against typically with white skirts, obviously the linen that they wore against their darker skin. You can even see the hairstyles that are not fundamentally at odds with African styles as well, right? Here's a couple of Africans slash Egyptians doing their daily tasks and so on. You can see that in the iconography. They're soldiers. Again, you can see their kilts versus their shields and the color of their skin kind of thing, and so on. And so this can go on, we can go on and on with this, but it's just to suggest, and the reason why this is important is because how many times is Egypt mentioned in the biblical text? Absolutely. The Israelites are birthed in an Afro-Asiatic context. They're in Egypt when they become a nation, ultimately, and they are released from enslavement, right? And then we know that even Solomon is married to Pharaoh's daughter, and I mean, Egypt is just ubiquitous in the biblical text. So when we think about people of African heritage interacting with peoples in the biblical world, this is not a distant relationship, as we've often thought about. Now, I also do a study on Black Hebrew Israelism, which claims that all ancient Hebrews were black peoples, and I dispel that myth because that is not true. We have many portraits or iconography of ancient Semites that looked like Middle Eastern people look today, and they were distinct from Africans. But it doesn't mean that Africans were not part of that as well. Africans were fundamentally part of ancient Hebrew culture and society, including the fact that Moses, the leader of the group, was married to a Cushite woman. Okay, we know that in fact the priestly family seems to be quite involved with the Cushites because Nehesi or Phinehas. This is the Egyptian name for the Nubian. Nehesi, Phinehas. So Phineas is the son of, grandson of Aaron. He's also the Nubian, literally. That's what his name means, among others. And there are numerous other examples of this. So we have Cushite peoples and black peoples as part of the ancient Israelite society. But I cannot make any claim that all of ancient Hebrew society were black peoples. When they were birthed in an Afro-Asiatic context, right? Several hundred years in Africa. And so clearly you would have had some kind of mixture, but there were also boundaries, right? So overlap culturally, ethnically, but there are also boundaries, right? So no claims to that idea that all ancient Hebrews were black peoples and so on, which is problematic theologically on a number of other fronts. But the point is that the interaction between biblical peoples and African peoples were significant throughout all periods, from Abraham marrying an Egyptian to all the way down to the Ishmaelites and others who came from that, among other things. So when we think about ancient, and it's not to suggest, because the further north you go, the closer to Syria, Palestine you are, obviously the more concentration of Canaanite populations and Canaanite Egyptians, right? So obviously, we're not claiming, we're making the claim that ancient Egypt was fundamentally African, but all other peoples were also part of that cultural nexus. So let's take a couple minutes break, and then I'll finish up with this last talk, if you have any more endurance. Can you handle any more? Or is this enough? Called Cushites in the Hebrew Bible, because this is dealing not so much with the ancient, well, it does delve into the ancient Egyptians, but it concentrates on the Cushites, the people, which I'll show you in a moment who the Cushites are. And in terms of the book, you can get this at, all the libraries have it. You can get the U of A library, USC library, on any of the university libraries will carry it. So I usually don't encourage people to buy it, because if you order it on Amazon, last time I see it was like 239 Canadian for it. Yeah, so just borrow it from the library. So, in any case, if you have any questions on this particular, what I've talked about here, then I'm happy to answer them. Sure. You can borrow it until I'm ready to leave. The publisher sent me, is it 6 copies? And I've given away 4 so far. I'm holding on to the last 2. One of them belongs to my mom. I have to give it to my mom, but she lives in Toronto. I haven't seen her in a few years now. So I have to. Yes. Okay. 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 Well, I don't know what Jesus was. I know he was Jewish, and right? And I know that ancient Jews had a variety in terms of had a spectrum. I mean, ancient Jewish peoples were from every. I showed you this morning, every culture, everybody, no one excluded. But the Bible is deafeningly silent on what Jesus looked like. Doesn't mention that he had long hair. Doesn't mention that he had light or dark skin. Doesn't mention anything about that. So the question is a moot one as far as I'm concerned. I cannot make any claims that Jesus had dark skin and was black, nor can I make any claim that he was white with blue eyes at all. Right? And someone would say, well, he was able to hide in Egypt. I don't know that that's a strong, and it's a darker population, but I don't know it's a strong argument. I mean, there were light peoples in Egypt as well as dark peoples, right? So everybody was in Egypt and could hide. Yes, of course, exactly. That's what the gospel is about. It is not about skin color. But the problem, of course, which I have to address if I had time, was the fact that for a long time we have portrayed Jesus as a Nordic looking individual, but that has political and all kinds of undertones with that portrait of Jesus, which is why I believe we shouldn't make any portraits of Jesus whatsoever, which is the second commandment, really, not to make any image, not making, because once we make him, we're making him in our own image, essentially, right? So the question of Jesus's race is moot. It's a non-issue biblically speaking because he represents all of us. I'm not sure I understood you clearly, but I'm going to talk about the Sudanese pharaohs in a moment, the 25th dynasty pharaohs that are. Okay, okay. I'm not sure. Under before the Egyptian pharaohs go way back, and they go back to, as most Egyptologists would say today, from the south. They actually came from south to north. South to north, yeah, that's the ancient argument, and actually Egyptology is bearing it out today that they came from south to north. So, and that there's again a fundamentally brotherly sister relationship between these two cultures. In fact, I'll show you in a moment that the Bible puts them together. Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, and Cush are brothers in the biblical text, along with Canaan and Put, right, which is Libya. So biblically, they're also brother sister nations, right? Geographically, they share a border. So naturally, you're going to have movements across. In as much as in the north, Egypt borders Canaan, so you're going to have a lot of Canaanite peoples in the north, and you're going to have mixtures of peoples and this gradation of skin tone and colors as you go along. Yeah, down the Nile. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please, Michael. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, great question. Great question. And in the latter part, yeah, I mean, it's part of that narrative that has been dominating the globe over the last century, few centuries. But when Zionism came into being, birthed, it was Zionism is the idea of repatriating Jewish people, right, from back to Israel, right? So Zionism was led largely by Europeans. And there is this idea of European Jewry. You've probably heard of the Ashkenazi Jews versus the Sephardic Jews and so on. And the largest branch of Jewry is Ashkenazi Jew. Um, a gentleman by, by the name of Kostler, he's also of Jewish origin. He came out with his book in the 60s, and his book was basically, what was the title of his book? Um, Anyways, Kostler's book, he basically says that the Ashkenazi Jews are largely converts of the Khazarian kingdom, right? In the Middle Ages, Khazaria was ultimately destroyed by Genghis Khan's army and so forth. But before it was destroyed, the whole kingdom had converted to Judaism, and consequently, they spread out into Poland and other parts of the world when the kingdom was destroyed. And that's most of world Jewry is Ashkenazi from Khazaria. But many people have used that in a very insidious way, his argument. And so they've tried to exclude Ashkenazi and suggest that they're Edomites, they're of the devil, they're not real Jews, and so on and so forth. I don't buy that argument at all. Is there some kernel to what Kostler's argument is? There may be something to it. I don't think it's baseless, but I don't necessarily even endorse the idea that the entire kingdom of Khazaria became Jewish or converted to Judaism, because of course there was a political move. You have Islam to his right, to the east, and Christianity to the left, and he's right in the middle. So he had to convert to Judaism, and to try to broker a neutral ground and whatnot. So there may be something to his argument, but many have dismissed his argument as baseless. That yes, there were Jewish people there, but and there may have been some measure of conversion, but it does not, first of all, it does not denigrate Jewish people and to suggest that European Jews are not true Jews. Because if they have Jewish blood, they are Jews, right? But his argument is not sound, in other words, and many scholars have contested his argument. But others have used it in insidious ways and in invidious ways to try to demote and denigrate people, Jews of European origin, which I think is terrible, really. Jewish people is not any particular ethnic group. And even if Ashkenazi Jews are the largest group, it does not mean that ancient Jews necessarily were entirely European. Does that make sense? So you have Jews that are coming in from everywhere in the diaspora, mingling and mixing together. If you go to Cambodia and you see a Jewish person, they look like a Cambodian. I've seen pictures of I haven't seen them personally, but pictures of Japanese and Chinese Jews, they look like any Chinese or Japanese person. Right, but they're Jewish still, and who knows how far back they go. They may not even be converts, but have a genetic line. But many are also proselytes and so forth. It's hard to tell the difference between, let's say, everybody descended from Abraham, but that doesn't really matter, right? If you've been a convert, 10, 20 generations ago, how do you know, where do you draw the line? And then other Jews that have Abraham's blood, they're mixed in together and all of that, right? Through marriage and so forth. So I don't even make a distinction. A Jewish person, you claim to be Jewish, you're a Jewish person, right? So, I don't remember what your original question was. The diversity, yeah. 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 Yeah, absolutely. And there are many other groups. The Igbo in Nigeria, you got people in Madagascar, you got a number of other groups that some of them aren't recognized by Israel as official, because that could have political implications with all these people migrating to Israel. And, the Igbo people are over 30 million, for example. I mean, so there are all kinds of reasons for those things. But in other words, Jewishness, like Christianity, is not restricted to any one people group. Right? All are inclusive. And so we don't hear that narrative often, you're right, because the dominant face that we see that represents Jews and Judaism are people of European origin, which that's where Zionism began, essentially, right? and so on. But again, I don't dispute if a person is of Jewish heritage, whatever color they are, that, that's legitimate as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Now let's jump into this last section, and then we'll wrap it up. Call it an afternoon. Take care, Michael. Thanks for Doctor stopping by for sure. All right. When we talk about ancient Kush, just a couple of things too. Here is the modern border of Egypt and the Sudan. Okay, and that's the border of modern Egypt, North Sudan, but today, anyways, but the Sudan. The ancient border of Egypt and the Sudan is there at the first cataract at Aswan. So ancient Nubia began here. We call this up until the third cataract, Lower Nubia, particularly first and second cataracts, Lower Nubia. And Egypt, ancient Egypt and Kush competed endlessly for this territory. Okay, because this is where all the gold was. Lower Nubia was the gold capital of the ancient world. Okay, there were gold mines here that Egypt coveted, and of course, Nubia was not going to just let up. Of course, Egypt dominated Nubia for much of its history, but also Nubia invaded, conquered, and dominated Egypt for a shorter period of time as well. So this is the when we talk about Nubia, this is the map here. Remember I mentioned Meroe. This is the kingdom of Meroe where it's situated, and Khartoum is now the capital of the Sudan, I believe, North Sudan or something. So Meroe is this ancient kingdom where the Kandake had her domain right there. Of course, not just restricted to here, but the kingdom extended all the way there, but the capital was there. So when it came to ancient Egypt, the Nubians, according to Egyptologists, they played a role, Kushite soldiers, played a role in just about every struggle or military force whose composition is recorded textually or visually. In other words, Kushite soldiers were an integral part of the Egyptian army from time immemorial. And thus, from the very old kingdom, the earliest days, even before Abraham, when Pepi I sent a paramilitary expedition into Syria, Palestine, he recruited Nubians from Urget, and Nubians from Medja, Nubians from Yam, Kwa, and Wawat, and so forth. He basically had Nubians as a central core of his army. Why? Because they were renowned as archers, okay, as soldiers. They were renowned for their archery skill in the ancient world. And so Donald Redford, one of the leading Egyptologists and biblical scholar, says, as in Egypt, so in Asia, Egypt employed, in addition to garrison troops and commissioners, a sizable police force comprised largely of Nubians, originally in the Medjay tribe. So in the New Kingdom, when Egypt expanded and controlled Syria, Palestine, all of Canaan, it also controlled Nubia. It was Nubian soldiers who were the police force in all of Egypt's domain, all of its empire. It was people of African descent. And so we see, for example, in the 13th century, in the Amarna period, the kings from Syria, Palestine are writing to the Pharaoh, send us troops. We need more troops. And what troops are they asking for? They need troops from Meluha, another name for Cush. Give us 20 men from Cush and 20 from Egypt to guard the city of the king. We need 100 men and 100 soldiers from Cush, Kashi, and 30 chariots that we may guard the land of my lord until a large force of archers, Cushite archers, comes out. So we need this. Send us more soldiers from Cush. The word Cush, of course, occurs upwards of 60 times in the Hebrew Bible in various contexts. And the way that Cushites occur in how they're portrayed in the biblical text is largely as soldiers, okay? Not slaves, not enslaved at all, but soldiers. They are soldiers in all of these different contexts. And most of the times when you see Cush in the text, Cush is in alliance with these various kingdoms. Most of the time, Cush is in alliance with Egypt, period. Why? Because they share a common border. And they're also in alliance with Libya, with Arabia, with Saba, and which were the Sabaeans, and with Put, which are the Puntites on the Red Sea, and so on. So they are often in alliance with these various peoples, and these are just some of the texts I've thrown up there. You can take a look at, but there are many others as well, where Cushites are in league militarily with these other people. So from a biblical perspective, the ancient Cushites are seen as a powerful military people. We can see this, for example, in Isaiah chapter 18, where they are depicted. It says, "Go, swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, a people feared near and far, a nation powerful and subjugating, whose land the rivers divide." Cushites are understood as a powerful military people. Not as James Mays and others said in their commentary, that they were slaves, and slaves were so frequently drawn from them. It's the contrary from the biblical perspective. The Cushites are military people that were feared near and far. They were powerful and subjugating, according to the text. Here is the 25th Cushite dynasty. We have Alara, P, Shabaka, Shebetko, Taharuka, Tanwetamani, and so on. We have several of these Cushites that ruled Egypt. So the Cushites, Egypt had dominated Cush during the New Kingdom, in as much as they had dominated Syria, Palestine. And then after, in the 9th century, we begin to see Cush starts making incursions into Egypt, and started, in fact, the story of Zerah the Cushite, mentioned in 2 Chronicles 14. He comes with 1,000,000 men to invade Judah. And he's repulsed, it says, by Asa, king of Judah, because Asa trusted in the Lord his God, and basically decimated the army of Zerah the Cushite. And Zerah is coming from the south, coming through Egypt with a massive army to basically control and invade Syria, Palestine, but he's defeated. Subsequent to that, nonetheless, the Cushites go back on the ascendance and eventually conquers Egypt. What the Cushites did, you can see where Cush is here in this region, and of course stretches all the way there. But the Cushites expanded their empire essentially, and from the Nile, from Khartoum in the south, at least here, all the way up, and controlled all of this region right here. Okay, so they basically conquered up Egypt at first, and retreated, and then later they conquered Lower Egypt. This is the 8th century BC, in the time of Isaiah, for example, and so forth. So the Cushite dominion stretched all the way from their capital city in Napata all the way to the Lower Egypt, or what we call the Delta region in Egypt. And of course, what happened was the Cushite pharaohs, particularly on the Shabaka, moved their capital from Napata all the way up here to Memphis in Egypt. Okay, several of the pharaohs reigned here in Napata, but because of the Assyrian threat, the Assyrians are coming from over here, they moved their capital up here, all the way up here, so that they can have access to this region right here. Okay, so that's actually important biblically for a number of reasons. The Assyrians, of course, and the Cushites would clash in numerous battles until the Assyrians ultimately had the upper hand after almost several decades, almost a century of war between these two kingdoms. So the Cushites, for example, gets involved in Syria, Palestine in the 8th century because they are the pharaohs. They are the pharaohs of Nubia and of Egypt, but they're ruling from Memphis, as I showed you. They're ruling from their northern capital of Memphis, right here. So you can see how far they were in terms of their relationship to Syria, Palestine. There's Jerusalem. Now they've moved their capital up here. They control all of this region, including Thebes, and they move their capital here so that they can easily dispatch soldiers to fight against the Assyrians, who are also vying for control of Syria, Palestine. So one of the first instances that we have is found in 2 Kings 17:4. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea. Hoshea was one of the last kings of northern Israel. Okay, not Judah, but Israel further north in Samaria. And he was under vassalage to the Assyrian king. So the reason why the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea is because he sent messengers to the king of So and offered tribute, no longer offered tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So he started sending his tribute to the south to King So. Who is King So? King So is identified as King P, one of the first, well, not the first, but at least one of the main, one of the early pharaohs of the Kushite dynasty. And so the Assyrian king invades and imprisons him. And so we see how the Kushites and the Assyrians begin to clash. Because once the Assyrians invade, now the Kushites have to send soldiers into Syria, Palestine. And we see this depicted, for example, on these Kushite soldiers. These are Assyrian tablets, murals, reliefs that depict Kushite soldiers, typically clean-shaven, flat, blunt nose, etc., fighting against the Assyrians in defense of northern cities. These are not cities in Egypt. These are cities in Syria, Palestine, all the way up to Hamath in the north. Northern Syria, Palestine. We have Kushite soldiers fighting against the Assyrians, and they depict them typically like this, with tightly curled hair, and on their fighting against the Assyrian soldiers. We have a number of these portraits, Assyrians showing these Egypto-Kushite soldiers, a combination of both Egyptians and Kushites, fighting against them as they're making their way down into Syria, Palestine. One of the things that we see is the prophet Isaiah is quite upset with the Judean leaders in the latter part of the 8th century, Hezekiah in particular, because Hezekiah is making an alliance with Kushite Egypt. He's sending his treasures to Egypt in defense for Egypt to come to his aid. So he becomes a vassal of the Kushites and the Egyptian Kushites, right? And we can see this quite clearly in the text, and I'll show it to you right now in the biblical text. According to Isaiah, right? Remember, the Kushites are at Memphis, up the north. The Judean elites, according to Isaiah, are carrying their riches on the backs of donkeys and their treasures on the humps of camels to a people that cannot profit them. Isaiah says the Egyptians are not going to be able to benefit you. For the Egyptians' help is worthless and empty. Therefore, I have called her Rahab, who sits still. So it's a Proverbs. He's taunting them. So he's basically telling the Judean elites, do not bring your treasures to Egypt for help against Assyria. Trust in the Lord your God. That's his argument. Isaiah's central concern is that they're making alliances with Egypt rather than trusting in their God against the Assyrians. Of course, Hezekiah is portrayed as a good guy who basically Hezekiah throws off the Assyrian yoke, but he's also depending on Egypt, and you'll see why. We know you'll see that in the text. I'm going in the wrong direction here. Maybe I'm going in the right direction. So again, they're sending their treasures from Jerusalem on a horseback down to the Pharaoh for the Pharaoh to come to their defense. And yet Hezekiah is also portrayed as a good guy. According to Isaiah 31, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, trusting in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, and look not to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek Yahweh. That's his primary contention. You're not looking to your God. You're looking to man for their help. You're looking to another power for their help against Assyria. And so they're going down to Egypt and bringing their treasures, right? They're paying a hefty sum. Why? Because you're becoming a vassal. As a vassal, you're required to send tribute to your overlord. That's the goal. And the overlord would defend you, right? In turn, would defend you against attacks, right? So again, Isaiah says, woe to the rebellious sons, says Yahweh, who follow advice, but not from me, who seal alliances. They're going in a deal, not sanctioned by my spirit, that they may add to sin, who go down to Egypt, though they have not inquired of me, to seek refuge in the strength of Pharaoh, and to take shelter in the shadow of Egypt. This is in the time of Hezekiah again. They're going to Egypt, to the Kushite pharaohs, to seek help. Right? And God says, this is not a deal that I signed. This is not part of my plan for you. They're adding sin to sin, and they're rebellious because they're not looking to their God. They're turning to man for their help. And so Isaiah says, the Egyptians are men and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When Yahweh stretches out his hand, both the helper and the one being helped shall fall together. All of them will perish together. He's quite incensed, to be sure, against this alliance with the Cushites and the Egyptians. So he says in chapter 20, so the king of Assyria, this is the battle between these two groups, so will the king of Assyria lead away the prisoners of Egypt and the captives of Cush, young and old, naked and barefooted, with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. Then they will be fearful and ashamed because of Cush, their expectation, and Egypt, their pride. They are looking to the south for military help against the powerful Assyrians, the most dominating power at this time. And the only force that could have any hope of stopping them was Cushite Egypt. Of course, the realpolitik of the time demanded, as it were, that they look to another military power for help, right? Because unless in those times when you have kings that have particular faith in Yahweh, like Asa and David and others, most of them are not trusting in their God. They're looking for, how can we barter? Because they're a small kingdom. Sometimes we think Israel and Judah were these massive kingdoms. They were tiny kingdoms caught between world powers. In the south, Egypt, and in the north, in the early days, the Hittite kingdom, but later on the Assyrians and later the Babylonians, the Persians are all coming from the north. And they're a little tiny kingdom caught in the middle. And so they were always trying to negotiate power. And you're going to send tribute to this one, or we're going to send tribute to this one. And this is what's happening in the context of Isaiah. So they are the Cushites. The Sudanese are not slaves in the biblical world. In the Syria Palestine, it's the contrary. Hezekiah and the people of Judah are now under the vassalage of Egypt, which is ruled by the Cushites, right? And so, what a way the story turns. So, according to the Rabshakeh, who is the Assyrian Rabshakeh, he's taunting Hezekiah. And he says, on whom are you relying that you rebelled against me? Right? So Hezekiah was sending tribute to Assyria at first. Now he decides to rebel against Assyria and join with Egypt and become a subject of Egypt. See now, you're trusting in Egypt, that broken staff of a reed, which if a man leans on it, it will pierce his hand. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all those who trust in him. So both Isaiah and the Rabshakeh seem to be echoing the same thing. He's not gonna help you, according to Pharaoh, according to the Assyrian Rabshakeh, one of the generals in the army, right? So he's saying, you're trusting in Egypt and you've rebelled against me, but it's not gonna work out for you, okay? It's not gonna work out for you. And of course, then the Bible says in the same chapter, 2 Kings, then Sennacherib, the same guy who just taunting through his Rabshakeh, heard concerning Taharuka, the king of Cush. He has come out to fight with you. Why is he coming out to fight? Because Hezekiah is his vassal. He must protect his vassal. So he's come out to fight with the Cushite, fight with the Assyrians. According to the Assyrian record, now Assyria is always biased in the reporting, like all ancient kingdoms. They make up stories about their victories. Nonetheless, according to Sennacherib, in his account, in his inscription, Sennacherib says, the kings of Ekron, okay, which is biblical, or El Teke they call it, so there's the Philistines, along with Hezekiah, formed an alliance, okay, formed a confederation with the kings of Egypt and the archers, chariots, and horses of the king of the land of Meluha, which is Cush, right? So the Cush is, of course, the Cushite king is in charge of all these lesser rulers, which are titled as kings in the Assyrian record. So forces without number, and they came to their aid. So the Cushites came to help Hezekiah. He mentions by name. He mentions the king of Ekron, Padi. Oh, well, Padi is pro-Assyrian. He mentions Hezekiah by name and the people of Ekron, who will depose their king, Padi, and locked him up in Jerusalem, by the way. And so they sent for help against to the Cushites. So the Cushites come out with their other assistants to fight against Sennacherib. And of course, Sennacherib claims that he defeated them, and so on. The Cushites, on the other hand, claim that great victories over the Asiatics and so forth. So everybody's claiming victory. But the Bible claims another victory. Does anybody remember what happened when the Assyrian taunts Hezekiah and Isaiah read the letter? The Bible says, the angel of the Lord struck in that night 185,000 Assyrians. So Sennacherib doesn't mention this, right? And the Cushites, we don't know what happened. The Cushites seem to have withdrawn, right? Because they end up dominating Palestine thereafter until Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, comes onto the scene. Let me just show you a few more things here. This is a portrait of Lachesh. This is one of the sites in Israel today. They've dug it up and studied it archaeologically. And this is in Khorsabad, of course, Sennacherib's palace, where he's showing people that are bowing down to him, which many have connected to the Cushites, who are actually at Lachesh. Archaeologically, we have Cushite burials at Lachesh and remains and the like. Which is the most fortified Judean town at this particular time. So militarily, they are protecting Judah. And so we see where Sennacherib is victorious. The Bible tells us this, that he wins the battles ultimately. And a lot of people are put to death, including potentially these Cushites that are impaled around the wall. This is actually a Syrian portrait on the reliefs on their walls, showing how they impale the prisoners of Lachesh. Okay, these are Israelites or Cushites or both that are being impaled around the wall. Literally, they put a pole straight up. It's almost like crucifixion to say, "Do not rebel against us. If you do, this is what awaits you." So the Cushites are there to defend. Later on, here are some Cushites again on Esarhaddon. This is not Sennacherib now, but his son, actually his son's son, Ashurbanipal. This is Ashurbanipal's conquest of Memphis, and he portrays the Cushites typically with their headdress, where he sacks the city and captures the Cushites in Egypt. And this is prophesied in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and so on. So these are part of that whole historical account. So according to Sennacherib now, he says, in the plain of El Teke, which is biblical Ekron, I fought with them and defeated them. I captured the Egyptian charioteers and the princes together with the charioteers of the kings of the land of Meluha. So he said he captured their chariots and the like. But according to around the same time, we have these inscriptions from Shabaka and Taharuka saying he has slaughtered the Libyans, he has restrained the Asiatics. He crushed the hill country that revolted. He caused them to make the walks of dogs. The sand dwellers come, and no one knows not their place, fearing the king's ferocity. So the king, this is bombastic speech, of course, that is propaganda. But nonetheless, it serves the purpose to show this is a great king. The Pharaoh is defeating the Asiatics, presumably the Assyrians and the like. He's defeating them. And of course, Donald Redford tells us, among other historians, that Taharuka, which is a Cushite king, he had a dominance of the Philistine and Phoenician cities on the morrow of Esarhaddon's accession. So what happened was, when Sennacherib came and the angel of the Lord defeated him, of course, some historians said it was the Cushites that did it. I err on the side of the Bible. Nonetheless, Sennacherib withdrew, and for about 24 years, none of the Assyrians make another excursion westward. Okay, they do not come back to Syria, Palestine. Meanwhile, this guy, Taharuka, he is dominating Syria, Palestine, and all of Phoenicia, all of the Phoenician states, the Philistines, of course, Israel. Israel in the north is no more at this point, but at least Judah and so forth. So he's dominating this region for just after the battle. So something happened that turned the tide and gave the Cushites favor. And I'm not suggesting they did it in terms of driving out the Assyrians, but the fact that the Lord drove out the Assyrians, 185,000 of them died, their soldiers, gave the Cushites an opportunity to take advantage of of Syria, Palestine, and to dominate it. So when Esarhaddon, Esarhaddon was the son of Sennacherib, 20 some odd years later, he renews this struggle against Taharuka, and he sends his army now. Actually, he doesn't send them, he leads them westward. So this is what he says in his inscription. In the course of my campaign, I set up fortifications against Baalu, the king of Tyre, who trusted in his friend Taharuka. The king of Cush threw off the yoke of the god Ashur and kept answering me with insolence. So the Phoenician kings, which is, so if you know of the story of Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel originates from Tyre, okay? Her father is Ethbaal, the king of Tyre, but this is not him, okay? This is a later period, but this is the same name, Baalu, from Baal. She was, of course, obviously the name, the god Baal is in here, right? So he's the son of Baal and so forth. So he's the king of Tyre at this time, and he is now under Taharuka's control, just like Hezekiah had done before, sent his tribute to Taharuka. So does these Phoenician kings, not just Baalu, but a number of them, because the Cushite pharaoh is now dominating the region. And so he's answering the Esarhaddon with insult, right? Because he has protection from the Egyptians. And of course, everybody knew what happened 20 some odd years before. So, it's hence the reason why Sennacherib himself does not come back to Syria, Palestine. So I'm wrapping up here in a moment here. So according to Esarhaddon, I conquered Tyre, which is in the midst of the sea, and took away all the cities, possessions of Baalu, its king, who had trusted in Taharuka, the king of Cush. So Taharuka is being mentioned in the Bible. Taharuka is being mentioned on inscriptions. Taharuka is part of this Egyptian 25th dynasty that's biblical, because these are all biblical. This is biblical times. So according to the Babylonian Chronicle, when the Assyrians invades Egypt, they are defeated. In the 7th year, on the 5th day of the month of Adar, the army of Assyria was defeated in Egypt. So they tried to invade Egypt, and they're defeated. But eventually, Esarhaddon renews his war against Taharuka, and this time he does successfully invade Egypt. And so, according to Esarhaddon, who is the son of Taharuka, so he got defeated. He went back, renews his army. 2 years later, he comes back and tries to again attacks Egypt. As for Taharuka, the king of Egypt and Cush, I inflicted serious defeats on him daily without ceasing. Moreover, with regard to himself, by means of arrows, I inflicted him 5 times with wounds from which there is no recovery. Of course, that's not the truth. Taharuka would live to fight several battles over a decade with Esarhaddon, but he's exaggerating. But nonetheless, he does have the upper hand. He says, I carried off to Assyria his wife, his court ladies, Ushanuhuru, his crown prince, and the rest of his sons, his daughters, his goods, his possessions, his horses and oxen, his sheep, his goats, without number. I tore out the roots of Cush from Egypt. I did not leave a single person there to praise me. Of course, he's exaggerating here, but he did defeat Memphis. And this is a portrait of, as you can see the African features here, this is a portrait of the crown prince on Esarhaddon's stela that he's showing. This is the Cushite son, the crown prince of Taharuka, who he took away. As he said, he actually did take away because he sacked Memphis, the main city that I showed you earlier, and took him away. So eventually the Cushites would lose their place, but this is only one battle, because the Cushites eventually threw out the Assyrians, and then after, under Ashurbanipal, who's the son of this guy, that's when Ashurbanipal finally defeats Cush and got rid of the Cushites out of Egypt. So Taharuka is praying to his God on one of his inscriptions. He says, O Amun, that which I did in the land of Nehesi, allow that I may make for you tribute from the land of Kir, Syria, Palestine, which is turned from you. O Amun, my wives, allow that my children might live, turn death away from them. So this is when, of course, Esarhaddon captures his wives and his children and his crown prince. He's praying to his God for help. But nonetheless, what's important is that, before we wrap up, is that the Cushites were very influential in Syria, Palestine, including in the time of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, in fact, adopts a lot of Cushite iconography. This is Hezekiah's seal that we have, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, and he has the Cushite symbol right here. This is the scarab beetle symbol, the wind sun disk. So this is, of course, what Hezekiah would stamp letters and so forth with, his seal. And so he's very much involved with the Cushite dynasty, because the Cushites had a formidable influence in Syria, Palestine during that time period. We can see, again, these are jar handles in the time of Hezekiah belonging to the king, Lamelech jar handles with the same iconography of the Egyptian scarab. And of course, the Cushites had an influence. I could show you some other texts from Isaiah with the Cushites' influence on Jerusalem in terms of their architecture and so forth. But I will end by showing you the prophet Zephaniah, whom I quoted to you this morning. The prophet Zephaniah said, the word of the Lord came to Zephaniah. He's the son of Cushi, okay? And he's the Gedaliah, he's the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, who's the son of Hezekiah in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon. So you can see where the royal houses of Hezekiah and Cushite royal houses are together, because this Zephaniah the prophet is tracing his heritage all the way back to Hezekiah. Okay, hence the reason why he prophesies against the Cushites. He says, you Cushites, you also shall be slain by my sword. And then next he says, from beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, shall bring mine offering. Because now we can see the intermingling of the royal houses of Cush and of Hezekiah, because Hezekiah was a vassal of the Cushite state. Okay, so and Zephaniah is a prophet of Cushite origin or descent. Clearly, he traces his lineage. My great-grandfather was Hezekiah, he says, but he's prophesying in part against Cush and for Cush, right? So I end all of this to say that, and I could have gone into Moses' Cushite wife, which is another interesting discussion. The dark woman, the lovely, beautiful woman in Solomon's story, and so forth. I can tell you about other Africans across the biblical world. But I wanted to bring out this military history to try to dispel the idea that ancient Cushites or Egyptians were enslaved or slaves in any society, whether Egyptian, and of course, Cushites were slaves, yes, in Egyptian society, just like Northerners were slaves in Egyptian society and so forth. But it doesn't mean that that was their place. It means that there were some Cushites who were slaves. But many were pharaohs, and they were at every echelon of Egyptian society, just like people from Canaan were at every echelon of Egyptian society. So this is just to kind of bring this background in terms of this military history. I was thinking at first maybe I should talk about other Africans in the biblical text and so forth. But you can kind of see why Moses is married to a Cushite woman. Whether the woman is Zipporah, Africans were never restricted to the biblical to Africa, or if the woman is an actual African, according to Josephus, she was an African from Ethiopia who called Tharbis, the daughter of the Ethiopian king, etc., etc. But the point is that peoples of African descent had a formidable influence on the biblical world. And at a crucial time when Jerusalem was rescued by the Lord, the Bible says, nonetheless, Cushites were there fighting on behalf of Israel, on behalf of Judah. Earlier, they were fighting on behalf of Israel when Samaria was taken captive and destroyed. So I will end here, and I appreciate your time and you have spent with me this evening. This has been very valuable for me, and just being able to share with you some of these research that I've been doing for the last little bit. So yeah, thank you for your time. Appreciate it very much.
The floor, see if there's any other questions before.
Okay.
My question is, so with you having this understanding and having this knowledge and the things that you study, and obviously you're very aware that many people don't have this knowledge.
Yes.
So what would be the one thing that you would suggest to pastors within the Christian faith to go and say, this is the message that you're missing. This is the message that you need to be sharing.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's a central message they need to be sharing, but in terms of diversity, in terms of inclusion, in terms of understanding how all peoples fit into the biblical story, yeah, I would say that they should read my book. I mean, that's probably the best thing. I mean, I'm being facetious, but I'm saying I don't have the time to go everywhere. I hardly take appointments these days because I'm so busy with a church plant that we're doing in Lacombe. There are others too, other scholars who have written on these things as well about Africans in the ancient world and the biblical world. But again, the main thrust of everything that I'm doing, whether I'm talking about the Ethiopian eunuch or I'm talking about Ebed-Melech the Cushite or Moses Cushite wife or this one or that, is just to so people can broaden their understanding of what the ancient peoples look like, because what we get is typically just artistic portraits of typically just Europeans, to be fair, when it comes to the biblical story. So from Adam all the way to Abraham to everybody looks European, but that is not the reality of the ancient world. Does that make sense? It's not the reality at all. And most people don't know that Hezekiah was being defended, and Jerusalem and Samaria were being defended by Africans, people from the Sudan, among other Africans, defending Jerusalem and defending Samaria at critical times in their history. So it's not well known, but it's very much brought out both by the biblical text, as well as the inscriptions that we have, and so on and so forth. So I'm being long-winded, but to say that insofar as we're talking about it, I would say some things that we can start doing is start diversifying pictures in the biblical world, insofar as we're going to do that. Don't just show one people. We were all there. Everybody's represented. Yeah. But I personally don't believe in making any portraits of Jesus. That's me. Just to go back to that. But I think we should that, again, we've used Jesus, an image of Jesus, in political and ways, and that's bad for bad witness, in my opinion. Yeah.
Dr. Burrell, before I got here, let's see.
Sure, please.
I was just curious, the notion of the 19th century that you shared at the beginning, that have been disproved by the advances of science in the century, or the 20th century, I guess, and then into the century.
Sure.
Has the discourse changed a little bit as a result of that? Like, do you see when you go to conferences and when you interact with others that people are adopting these new findings and they're accepting them and they're understanding that really the history has been different than what we have been taught for a long time?
Oh man, what a brilliant question. I wish it were the case, but it is not. Good news travels very slowly, evidently. Because the thing is that these old ideas are so ingrained, they're really entrenched, and scholars often refer to these old works without even thinking. So you will see commentaries still today that refers to Ethiopia as in modern Ethiopia. They don't know that ancient Ethiopia and modern Ethiopia are different in terms of location, for example, if they mention Ethiopia at all, because some still omit it, right? And in certain circles, Christian circles, often conservative, you will find where they're still going around with the idea of the curse of Ham, and therefore Africans are cursed, right? And so on. So these are not things that are well known, unfortunately, right? Some of these studies that I'm showing to you, they're not well known at all, right? I've discussed a number of them in the book and stuff, but they're not very well known, right? But yeah, so so think of it as in the 19th century we have, a whole school of scholars. This was the dominant view that percolated into the 20th century and filled textbooks and commentaries and stuff. So what we're putting out now is cheesecake compared to the plethora of misinformation that came out previously. So it's going to take so much time and effort and publications and so forth to make a dent and to change those views. Fortunately, those views are, at least when it comes to informed scholars, yes, you will see commentaries that are now making reference to Cush, that are now including Cush as on the map, right? Because many biblical maps don't even include Cush, right? So this is some of my arguments. You got to include Cush. Cush was a central part of that history. Not just me, but other scholars are making the same argument. And so commentaries are coming around slowly in adopting some of these views and including Cush and giving accurate information about ancient Cush and dispelling this notion of enslaved in the ancient world or anything like that. Yeah, but what an excellent question you asked. Thank you.
Can I say something really quick?
Sure.
Doc, thanks first of all for what you're presenting. Just to address the question a little bit deeper, one of my favorite commentaries, as you and I were talking earlier, addresses this perspective on the opposite that you just presented.
Okay.
And so where I'm going with this is this commentary was written around the turn of the 19th century, I think early 19th century.
Okay.
Late 19th century, early 20th century. And so what I'm getting at is most pastors are referring to that kind of material still.
Yeah.
And that's material it's even in my office, in my house, in my library. And so it seems like there's got to be some sort of rewriting here. Okay, not just biblical reviewing, but also actual history that needs to be revisited and rewritten here. So I really appreciate what you're saying today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. But you're so right. I mean, many of the commentaries that you just grab off the shelf at my library or elsewhere have many of these old views in them in the same way. And again, because these were the views that prevailed for such a long time and had so much support, scholarly support. The evidence didn't matter. It was just an ideology that needed to be upheld. And so that's what was being championed. And so it percolated, and everywhere we influenced everything in biblical scholarship. So yeah, you're right. We will definitely need to as time goes on, and these new views come into vogue. We'll see more and more of that in our preaching and in our art and in our inclusivity, that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Maybe, I don't know if Pastor Guzman's going to close off and stuff, so thank you.
Simply wanted to come up here for the purpose of those that are going to be watching this later on as well and say thank you so much, Doc.
My
You
pleasure.
really enlighten us. I mean, you really blow some of the things, like I said, some of my commentaries, and I rely a lot on these commentaries because we trust the source. That's just the reality.
Yeah.
We trust the source, and the only thing we can continue to do is learning.
Yeah.
But we praise the Lord that there are scholars like you who are continue to study and bring the truth to light. So thank you so much. We appreciate you having here. I know that you've been blessed here, right?
Absolutely.
Those of you that are still awake, I should say. I'm kidding. But thank you so much, Doc. Let me shake your
Yeah,
hand.
absolutely.
And may the Lord bless your ministry.
Thank you kindly.
I do have a small gift on behalf of the Red Willow Church family.
Thank you very much, Red Willow. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much
Yes,
for making the
appreciate
trip today.
it. Yes, my pleasure.
May the
Thank you
Lord
for
bless you
having me,
guys.
Pastor. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, everyone. God bless.